He was humiliated within the university's walls by those who were supposed to teach and inspire. But 10 years later, he returned as the dean, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. What happens next will shock even the most seasoned observers. Michael Jennings walked across the cobblestone courtyard of Wilmington College, feeling the crunch of the stone tiles beneath his feet. The Victorian-style buildings, adorned with Gothic arches and stained-glass windows, looked like an impenetrable fortress. The air was filled with the scent of old books and chalk, mixed with the chill of a September morning. For other students, this place was just another step in their privileged lives. For Michael, it was a symbol of hope, proof that hard work and determination could overcome anything. He was the first in his family to attend university, and that thought filled his heart with pride. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You are our light, our chance to change the future." But behind that pride was a heavy burden of responsibility for his family, for his community, and for everyone who never got the chance to sit in these classrooms. First clash with reality. The first history class took place in a massive lecture hall, where carved wooden panels and antique clocks gave the room a museum-like feel. Michael sat in the middle, trying not to draw attention to himself. Professor Grayson, a man in his 60s with thick silver hair and icy gray eyes, paced back and forth in front of the podium. His deep, even voice echoed through the hall. "Today, we'll discuss the legacy of the colonial era and its impact on modern society." Michael listened attentively, taking notes in his neat notebook. At one point, when the professor asked a question about cultural traditions, Michael summoned his courage and raised his hand. His heart pounded, but he was ready. His voice was firm and confident. "I think the influence of African heritage on modern culture is often underestimated. Many musical and artistic traditions come from there." Before he could finish, Professor Grayson cut him off mid-sentence. His lips curled into a sneering smile, and his eyes narrowed, as if Michael were something shameful. "Perhaps you should read more before making such ridiculous assumptions," Grayson said sarcastically. The lecture hall froze for a moment. Then muffled laughter rippled through the air. It was quiet, but every snicker felt like a hammer striking the fragile glass of his self-esteem. Michael felt his face flush, his hands tremble with humiliation. He lowered his gaze to his notes. The lines of text blurred like ink on wet paper. He tried to take a deep breath, but his chest felt so tight that no air passed through. Michael glanced around furtively. Some students smirked at him. Others rolled their eyes pointedly. His attempt to express his thoughts had ended in public failure. Literature seminar, another blow. In the literature seminar, he hoped things would be different. Assistant Professor Ellen Brown, a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a strict suit, stood at the board discussing classic works. Her voice was cold and distant, like an autumn wind. Michael listened intently, preparing to discuss Toni Morrison's novel. When she asked for opinions on the book's symbolism, he confidently raised his hand. But her gaze passed over him like he was invisible, empty, and indifferent. "Let's give a chance to those who actually understand the material," she cut him off, without a hint of emotion. It felt like an invisible hand squeezed his heart. Michael's hand lowered slowly, and a lump formed in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Other students looked at him with either smirks or pity, which was even worse. In their eyes, he read, "You don't belong here." The feeling of isolation. Days turned into trials. In the cafeteria, conversations died down when he sat at a table, and within minutes, people found excuses to leave. In the library, he sought hidden corners to avoid contemptuous glances. Even the hallways became traps, each step accompanied by whispers and giggles behind his back. It felt like the university's walls were trying to push him back into the life he came from, a single stronghold, his mother's voice. Every evening, he sat in his tiny dorm room, which felt like a cage. In the dim light, the lamp illuminated a photo of his mother taped to the wall. Her smile was warm, like a sunbeam breaking through clouds. He dialed her number, and after a few rings, her soft, encouraging voice filled his ear. "Hi, son. How was your day?" He couldn't tell her the whole truth. He couldn't describe the pain and humiliation. Instead, he whispered, It's hard, Mom, but I'm holding on. She always knew what lay behind his words. Her voice turned firm and resolute. Remember, Michael, they fear your success. Their fear is proof of your strength. You're stronger than their prejudice. You are our pride, our light. Her words burned his heart, but also gave him hope. They were an anchor, keeping him from despair. He closed his eyes and imagined the day he would prove everyone wrong. In that moment, he vowed to himself he wouldn't break. He would turn every insult, every glance, every humiliation into fuel for his inner fire. Days filled with humiliation turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But instead of breaking under the weight of prejudice and hostility, Michael Jennings felt a fire growing within him. Pain and despair gave way to anger and resolve. He refused to stay silent. He was determined to do everything possible to ensure that not only his voice was heard, but also the voices of those who suffered the same injustices. The first step toward change. Michael started attending meetings of the minority rights student movement. These gatherings took place in an old lecture hall on the edge of campus, where those satisfied with the status quo rarely ventured. Here, he found like-minded peers, Black, Latino, Asian students, and even white students who supported the ideals of equality. Each of them had their own story of pain and humiliation, and each of them wanted change. At one of these meetings, Michael stepped onto the stage for the first time to speak. The spotlight blinded him, and nerves twisted his stomach. But when he began to speak, his voice was firm and unwavering. We are not here to silently endure insults. We deserve the same rights as every other student. Our worth is not defined by the color of our skin. His speech was met with a wave of applause. This moment was a turning point. Michael realized that his words had power, that he could inspire others to fight. This was not just a fight for himself. It was a fight for justice for everyone who came here with hope for equal opportunities. A voice of truth in the university newspaper. Every evening, after grueling lectures and seminars, Michael sat in the library or his tiny room and wrote articles for the university newspaper. He poured his pain and anger onto the page, transforming them into words that cut like a knife. His articles spoke of discrimination, of the cold disdain from professors, and of the silent acceptance of injustice. In our university, equality remains just a pretty word on a poster, he wrote in one article. But we will not stay silent. We will fight for the right to be heard and respected. The newspaper became his weapon, and each issue a battle. His words resonated with students who quietly suffered the same problems. Michael received letters of support, with others sharing their stories and thanking him for his courage. Retaliation from the administration. But his activism didn't go unnoticed. Professor Grayson, the same man who first humiliated Michael, took it as a personal challenge. He wrote an angry letter to the dean, accusing Michael of undermining academic standards and inciting hatred. Grayson argued that students like Michael created a dangerous atmosphere in the university and hindered the normal educational process. Assistant Professor Ellen Brown went even further. In one of her seminars, she held up a copy of Michael's article and smirked. I see that some students prefer to replace logic with emotions. This isn't an article. It's emotional nonsense. Her words drew laughter and nods of agreement from some students. But Michael no longer felt the same pain as before. Instead, he felt a cold determination. Every attack against him only strengthened his resolve. Fighting day and night. He studied during the day, burying himself in books and lectures, striving to be the best in every subject. At night, when the campus was asleep, he wrote petitions, gathered signatures, and prepared statements for the administration. His eyes grew red from lack of sleep. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but he refused to stop. You can do it, son. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. You are stronger than their hatred. The first fruits of his struggle. His efforts began to bear fruit. One of his friends sent Michael's articles to the local newspaper. A journalist who focused on social inequality saw his story as one that couldn't be ignored. Soon, An article about discrimination at Wilmington College appeared in the local news, and Michael Jennings's name was on everyone's lips. From that moment, the university was under public pressure. Students became braver in sharing their experiences, and professors began to tread more carefully. The atmosphere on campus started to shift. Small cracks appeared in the monolith of injustice that once seemed unbreakable. Michael knew. His fight was only beginning, but now he was not alone. Time flowed relentlessly, turning pain and humiliation into distant but never forgotten memories. After graduating from Wilmington College, Michael Jennings was a different person, hardened by struggle and filled with determination to change the world. He left the university with a diploma in hand and fire in his heart. His goal was clearer than ever: to achieve justice in education, where skin color would no longer be a decisive factor. The path to the top: right after graduation, he entered a master's program at one of the nation's top universities. His days were filled with study and research, and his nights with writing articles and books. He delved into archives, studied the history of inequality and systemic racism, tearing away the veil of silence that had shrouded these issues for decades. After earning his master's degree, Michael continued his education, pursuing a doctorate. His dissertation on the impact of systemic racism on education became a sensation in the academic community. Leading scholars cited his work, discussing it at conferences and in the media. Every paragraph of his research was infused with personal experience and pain, but also with hope and determination to change the system. Michael became a guest professor at prestigious universities across the country. He stood at podiums in lecture halls filled with hundreds of students, his voice firm and confident. He spoke about the injustice he had personally endured, the ongoing fight, and the importance of equality and respect. His lectures inspired young people to push for change and shattered prejudice like a hammer striking fragile glass. At the same time, he wrote books that exposed the roots of discrimination and suggested ways to eradicate it. Each book became a bestseller, and his name became a symbol of resilience and the fight for human rights. An unexpected letter. 10 years passed. Michael was sitting in his office, piled high with books and research papers, when his secretary entered and handed him a letter. The envelope was thick, bearing the official seal of Wilmington College. Seeing the familiar logo, Michael felt a tightness in his chest. He slowly opened the envelope and began reading. "The Board of Trustees of Wilmington College respects you and invites you to accept the position of Dean." His fingers trembled slightly. The words swam before his eyes. The same people who had once humiliated him were now offering him the leadership of the university. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Faces of his mother, his fellow student activists, and those who had supported him when the whole world was against him appeared in his mind. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to change everything. He didn't hesitate for a second. Michael accepted the offer. Inauguration Day. The day of the inauguration was bright and sunny, but the air was tense, like before a storm. The university's grand hall was packed. Students, professors, and journalists had gathered to witness the new dean's introduction. People whispered and exchanged glances, and some professors' faces were tense and pale. Michael stepped onto the stage. He wore a sharp, dark suit, but his posture and confident gaze stood out more than any clothing. The hall fell silent, as if a crypt. He slowly scanned the audience. Among them were the same people: Professor Grayson with lips pressed into a thin line, and Assistant Professor Ellen Brown, her eyes darting around nervously. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by anxiety. Michael took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of his difficult journey. "When I was a student at this university, it was a place of pain and humiliation for me. Here, I was taught not only knowledge, but also resilience in the face of injustice." The room was still, no one daring to move. He continued. "But today marks the beginning of a new era, an era where every student, regardless of their skin color, social status, or beliefs, will feel valued and protected, an era of justice and equality." The day after his inauguration, Michael Jennings stood before the mirror in his new dean's office. The office was spacious, with high windows and antique mahogany furniture. It was here, behind this massive desk, that decisions were made which shaped the futures of countless students. Yesterday, he had officially taken on this role, but today was the moment of truth. A meeting with those who once humiliated him and tried to break his spirit. He took a deep breath, feeling strength and determination fill his chest. He was wearing the same sharp suit, but now he wasn't just a student who could be easily dismissed or belittled. He was a leader who was ready to restore order and make it clear that the days of injustice were over. The University Council Meeting. Michael entered the University Council meeting room. The long black oak table was surrounded by professors and administrators. Among them were Professor Grayson and Assistant Professor Brown. Their faces were tense, their eyes downcast, and their hands nervously fidgeted with pens and notebooks. It seemed they were trying to blend into the walls, to avoid the gaze of the new dean. But Michael saw them clearly, the same people who had planted seeds of doubt and pain in his heart. He took his place at the head of the table and paused. The room was thick with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then he began to speak. "I've gathered you here to discuss the future of this university, a future where there is no place for prejudice and discrimination." His voice was firm, each word ringing with confidence and authority. Michael looked at everyone present, his gaze lingering on Professor Grayson, whose lips were pressed into a thin white line, and on Assistant Professor Brown, who avoided his eyes. "Your teaching methods," Michael continued, "do not align with modern standards and principles of justice. This university cannot and will not tolerate discrimination in any form." The moment of justice. Professor Grayson rose slightly from his chair, his voice trembling as he struggled to maintain a shred of dignity. "But I've always adhered to academic standards." Michael interrupted him calmly, yet firmly. "Your standards were based on prejudice and the exclusion of talented students. I experienced that firsthand, and no student will ever have to go through what I went through." Assistant Professor Brown, her face pale, tried to protest. "This is a misunderstanding. You can't." "I can and I will," Michael said resolutely. "From this day forward, there will be no place at this university for those who believe they are superior simply because they are accustomed to privilege." He picked up the documents in front of him and declared, "Professor Grayson and Assistant Professor Brown, you are dismissed. Your time here is over." His words landed like thunderclaps. The air in the room grew heavier. For a few moments there was silence, and then someone on the council began to clap. The applause spread, growing into a wave of approval. This was the moment many had waited for. The moment when justice finally prevailed. Grayson and Brown slowly stood up, their faces twisted with a mixture of anger and defeat. Without a word, they walked out of the room, leaving behind their past and their influence. Change takes root. For Michael, this wasn't just about revenge. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where every student would feel safe and respected. Shortly after this meeting, he announced new support programs for minority students. Anti-bias training courses for professors and students were introduced, along with seminars on equality and tolerance. New professors who shared the values of justice and inclusivity were hired. The walls that once symbolized isolation and fear for him were now filled with the energy of change. In the hallways, new voices echoed, full of hope and confidence. Students of all races and cultures sat together, discussing ideas and making plans for the future. The university that had once shattered his self-esteem now became a place where everyone could grow and thrive. A moment of pride. One day, standing by the window of his office, Michael looked out over the campus. He saw students hurrying to class, laughing and sharing their dreams. In the noise and movement, he saw the future he had fought for. His heart swelled with pride and peace. "Mom, I did it," he whispered, looking up at the sky where the sun peeked through the clouds. He knew his struggle hadn't been in vain. It had changed not only his life, but the lives of many others. And this university, once a symbol of his pain, was now a beacon of his victory and hope for future generations.